Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to the SOFLUX webinar today. I'm excited to be introducing Dr. Maddie Shankle. Maddie did her bachelor's in geology and geophysics and environmental engineering at Yale, and then did a master's in physical oceanography at Bangor before heading to the University of St. Andrews, where she did her PhD in geochemistry, and now she is there as a postdoc. Maddie works on kind of a range of physical and also biogeochemical oceanography across kind of a range of different regions, global, thinking about the polar regions especially, combining kind of proxy data and numerical simulations. Now possibly also thinking about modern day timescales, perhaps. I'm super excited to hear Maddie's presentation about Southern Ocean carbon outgassing. And yeah, you can take it away, Maddie.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you. It's really great to be here, and I want to start by thanking SOFLUX for having me. As Channing was saying, I am a paleo person, but with my new postdoc, I'm moving into contemporary oceanography. So I'm glad to be part of this group and speaking to this group. Um, as was said, I just recently finished my PhD at the University of St. Andrews. And what I did in it was I studied major changes in ocean circulation over Earth's past glacial cycles. And specifically, I looked at how those impacted the ocean's ability to uptake and store carbon. Now, today I'll focus on Southern Ocean outgassing, which you all will know results from the connection between carbon-rich deep waters and the surface. And this connection gives the region really strong influence over how much carbon stays down in the deep versus going out to the atmosphere. So you can see going into the past how these dynamics could be central to driving our ice age cycles and driving CO2 drawdown during glacial periods. So today I'll show you how Southern Ocean outgassing could have been reduced by a better ventilated North Pacific during the last ice age. Okay, so to just give an overview of the topics I'll cover, I'll first give a crash course in the ice ages, what we need, what we know about them, what you need to know for this talk. I'll then speak a little more specifically to the major role played by Southern Ocean biogeochemistry in inducing glacial CO2 change, which at times I'll abbreviate as SO and BGC. I'll then consider how the old isolated waters of the North Pacific today serve as a major source of carbon and nutrients to the Southern Ocean, contributing to outgassing there. And finally, I'll present simulations in which the North Pacific is better ventilated, which is something we have proxy evidence of from the last ice age. And I'll show how this actually reduces the carbon and nutrient content of those waters feeding the Southern Ocean, ultimately reducing outgassing. All right, so if you're doing paleo, I think the ice ages are a really interesting regime to look at because they represent the most recent episodes of major climate change available for us to look at in Earth's past. So there's a lot to be learned from how the ocean was different over these evolving states, and particularly what changes in the ocean could have contributed to these CO2 swings that we see. Now, these cycles have actually been a feature of Earth's natural climate variability for the last over 2 million years or so. But here I'm just showing some of the canonical proxy data that we have just over the last 800,000 years. So time is marching forward to the present day here on the right. So let me just translate what some of these proxies are showing. So you can see, we see this repeated pattern of dips down into colder conditions with larger ice sheets on land. And this is happening on a cycle of about 100,000 years. And also, of course, it comes as no surprise that atmospheric CO2 levels are also varying in step with these climatic changes. So, thanks to the hard work of paleoceanographers, we have these cycles really well preserved and documented in a diverse range of proxy archives. Now, where it gets even more interesting, in my opinion, is when we start thinking about what's driving these cycles and what's driving the CO2 change. So, what we do know is that the timing of the descent into these repeated glacial conditions, this is paced by these regular variations in Earth's orbit known as Milankovitch cycles. And basically, these alter how incoming solar insolation is distributed over the face of the planet. And this largely kicks off whether a large ice sheet can or cannot grow in the north. So the timing of that switch is paced by these orbital cycles. However, these cycles don't change the total insolation received by Earth, so the actual watts per meter squared of incoming solar energy. It doesn't change that much at all. Like I said, they mainly just alter the latitudinal distribution of where it's received and also the seasonality. But in terms of total solar energy, these cycles on their own don't come near to explaining the full magnitude of temperature and CO2 fluctuations that we see. But that's not a problem. It just means that these orbital changes must kick off some processes or feedbacks within the Earth system that themselves act to strongly take up CO2 and really drive us into a deep glacial state. So, if we consider what could be going on within the Earth system, what could be taking up all that carbon when it's coming out of the atmosphere, well, first we can rule out the lithosphere, since the process of geological weathering takes much too long to explain these cycles. And that pretty much leaves the biosphere, so trees and plants on land, and the ocean as potentially taking up this CO2. And basically, it's not the biosphere, one, because that got bulldozed by the growing ice sheets. So actually, we lose a major store of carbon there. And two, the ocean is a much larger reservoir of carbon, capable of taking up vast amounts of carbon and actually inducing a change in the atmosphere. And it can also hold on to that carbon for a much longer time than the biosphere, especially if the carbon gets into the deep, deep ocean. And so this residence time is more in line with the actual documented duration of the ice ages. So, for all these reasons, the ocean is suspected to be a key culprit for what's taking up all this carbon from the atmosphere. And it essentially amplifies the initial orbital forcing by undergoing changes in its circulation and chemistry that drive even greater uptake of carbon and drive us into a glacial state. So, this hypothesis was established pretty early on. And this idea that the ocean takes up carbon over a glacial cycle is itself becoming increasingly supported by proxy data, such as this record here. So this comes from a sediment core in the Indian Ocean sector of the Southern Ocean. And we're looking at just the last glacial cycle here. So just this most recent up, down, up in the CO2. And we have CO2 again on top as recorded in ice cores, and some data of mine on the bottom showing the concentration of DIC, or dissolved inorganic carbon, over time of the waters bathing this deep site, which sits at about 3,300 meters depth. So these two records together show very nicely how, as CO2 declines gradually out of the atmosphere over this glacial cycle, these deep waters are gaining more and more carbon. And this mirrored relationship is shown really nicely if I just flip that record up on top. This is really remarkable for a proxy record to get such clear data and such clear correspondence. So besides this, there are lots of other records like this as well, from different proxies and different locations, all documenting enhanced deep ocean carbon storage. And I should also say that the magnitude of carbon documented in these proxies does account for the full ppm drawdown we have recorded in ice cores. So this is all just to say a really nice picture is being built up and has been built up of the deep ocean's role in taking up carbon over a glacial cycle. So great. Well, you now might be left wondering how did the carbon get down there? What changed and what oceanic processes were kicked into gear to drive this pumping of carbon down into the deep? Well, this was the main focus of my PhD, identifying processes like this. And I want to stay with the Southern Ocean now because being a major conduit between the surface and the deep, it's believed to have played a key role in accumulating and keeping that carbon down at depth away from the atmosphere. And today, as I said, I'm just going to focus on Southern Ocean outgassing as one of the potential mechanisms for changing CO2 over a glacial cycle. Now, again, as I'm sure this group will know, there is significant outgassing in the Southern Ocean today. And I should clarify before I go any farther, I'm speaking more towards the pre-industrial state of the Southern Ocean before anthropogenic influences. So yes, the Southern Ocean is taking up significant amounts of anthropogenic carbon, but I'm speaking more towards the pre-industrial, pre-perturbed background state of the Southern Ocean. So there is significant Southern Ocean outgassing to the atmosphere. And in part, this is driven by strong wind-driven upwelling that delivers these really carbon and nutrient-rich waters up from depth. But exacerbating this, and this is getting into the importance of biogeochemistry now, exacerbating this is the fact that Southern Ocean productivity and its ability to take up CO2 is limited by a severe lack of iron. And as a result, while upwelled major nutrients like nitrate and phosphate are very abundant, productivity actually struggles to use them, and they, to a large extent, go unused because of this iron limitation. So while productivity would normally use these nutrients and act to take up and counteract some of this CO2 evasion to the atmosphere, in the Southern Ocean, it can't, and it essentially can't keep up with this oversupply of carbon and nutrients from the upwelling. So this leads to a relatively inefficient, or what we call leaky, biological pump of carbon, meaning the biology takes up some carbon but loses a lot of it. Okay, so this is the present day. But returning to the question of the ice ages, plugging or partially stemming this leak of carbon, so to speak, would be one pretty good way of proportionally keeping more carbon in the ocean and out of the atmosphere and shifting that partitioning. So there are a few ways you could do this, reducing this outgassing. First, you can have changes in circulation. So reducing the upwelling rate would help with this, obviously, as would enhanced stratification. That's also a possibility. So keep these things in mind. These are the current working hypothesis for what happened in the Ice Age, and I'll discuss that on the next slide. Next, we can have sea ice that can affect our outgassing and could have acted as a cap or a lid to the outgassing. And sea ice was certainly expanded during the ice ages and during the cold glacial states. However, it's since been found that to be an effective mechanism of atmospheric CO2 change, this requires unrealistic coverage of the Southern Ocean. But an even more convincing piece of evidence we have here is that proxies refute there being any strong light limitation back into the past. And what I mean by that is if there was significantly greater coverage over the Southern Ocean by sea ice, this would also introduce a pretty large degree of light limitation on biology. And there's strong proxy evidence that nutrients continued to be used, and in fact, were even more greatly used and taken up over an ice age, which wouldn't have been likely to happen under the absence or reduction of light. So more on the nutrients coming up, but the sea ice capping mechanism is not currently believed to be an effective or even well-evidenced means of reducing glacial outgassing. So finally, we can also reduce outgassing by biological means and essentially alleviating biology's present limited ability to keep up with this oversupply of carbon and nutrients. So one obvious way to ramp up the biology would be to give it more iron. And this was an early hypothesis for glacial CO2 drawdown, known as the iron fertilization hypothesis. And it's true, at one point, the Southern Ocean did indeed receive more iron, and this came from stronger winds under glacial conditions and greater dust fluxes off of the continents into the ocean. However, it should be noted that this actually kicked off quite late in the Ice Age cycle, and furthermore, while its impact is estimated to be substantial, it's certainly not accounting for the entirety of Ice Age CO2 drawdown. All right, so besides iron fertilization, how else could we improve biology's limited ability to counteract this CO2 evasion? Well, again, what we really need to do is reduce this huge supply of carbon and nutrients coming up. Again, because what our productivity needs is not more nutrients like nitrate, it's iron. So with a reduced overall supply, our limited productivity would be better able to keep pace, so to speak, with the now lesser supply of carbon coming up. All right, so in either context, by circulation or by biogeochemistry, we're considering reducing the carbon and nutrient supply coming up to the surface. And excitingly, reduced carbon and nutrient levels in the Southern Ocean surface is something evidenced by glacial proxy data. So here's a little foraminifera to indicate we're looking at conditions recorded in surface waters. And we're looking again at just the last glacial cycle here and a bit into the penultimate glacial as well. So the gray areas denote peak glacial conditions. And there's the CO2 record again to help show you the low CO2 cold periods. Okay, so these records are from several different sites all around the Southern Ocean, and I'll now explain why they indicate reduced carbon and nutrient supply during the glacial periods. So what each of these proxies are showing, and in some cases multiple proxies, are biological export production rates, nitrate utilization, which is how much of the available nitrate pool are you using? 5% of it, 50% of it, 100% of it. So not a measure of supply, but of intensity of use. And finally, we have a proxy for ventilation. And I'll come back to that one in a minute. So for now, let's just focus on what these first two panels are doing. So first, we see a complete collapse of these purple lines under glacial periods, so completely reduced levels of export production. And while export production is not a direct one-to-one indication of productivity, with levels this low, we are expecting productivity to have been strongly reduced, if not collapsed as well. So reduced productivity. Next, with this increasing nitrate utilization trend, this means proportionally more and more of the available nitrate pool was getting used up. So again, not more supply, but of the supply you do have, you're using proportionally more of it, 80, 90, 100% of it. That's what this trend to increasing heavier nitrogen isotopes indicates. So if you think about it, it's a bit puzzling. Going into peak glacial conditions, how could you be using more of your available nutrients and still productivity is still so low? Well, the only way you could be getting less productivity alongside greater utilization is if the total pool of nitrate itself is getting smaller. So you're using a greater fraction of something that's getting smaller. That's how you have reduced productivity. So there's that signal, evidence of a reduced nutrient supply going into surface waters. And whatever is reducing the nutrient supply, we expect to equally be reducing the carbon supply since the two co-vary together and are generated together by remineralization in deep waters. But I should also say that this is also supported by glacial proxy data, a reduced carbon load in Southern Ocean surface waters. I just thought you would be tired of looking at squiggly lines at this point. So now as to how this supply was reduced, many people so far have thought about reducing, as we said before, the circulation and the physical delivery of water up from depth. So that could have been done by reduced upwelling rates, or equally enhanced stratification could have inhibited mixing either mid-depth or surface and kept those nutrients and carbon from coming up so easily. Now, these changes probably did happen during the Ice Age. Winds over the Southern Ocean were weaker and, in fact, shifted slightly equatorward, so away from where they could pull up the deepest and most carbon-rich isopycnals. But with the actual estimated magnitude of these shifts, it's far from the strong reduction in upwelling that you might anticipate as really significantly impacting your nutrient levels. And especially with how carbon and nutrient rich these deep waters are, it's hard to imagine such a modest shift really having such a large impact on your nutrient supply. And similarly, for enhanced stratification, it would have to have been pretty dramatic, and it's never something that's really emerged strongly, for example, from glacial like ocean simulations. Some PMIT models even show enhanced convection and mixing with greater sea ice formation and brine rejection. So it's a bit unclear, and furthermore, there doesn't seem to be any strong proxy evidence for these surface waters really being strongly cut off from communication with waters below. If anything, there's a slight positive signal towards better ventilation in these waters in the proxy data. So the general picture that emerges is that this is just such a dynamic and active region, even in the ice ages, that it's hard to imagine and could this have been reduced? Could this explain the low supply? And this is the novelty of this study. While this signal in the proxy data is likely in part the result of reduced physical delivery, no one so far has considered that the composition of the water itself could have been changed and reduced. So there we go. And that's what I'll demonstrate in the second half of this talk with the Earth system model simulations. Okay, so to summarize what we've covered so far, first, I talked about how feedbacks internal to the Earth system are important for driving us into ice age conditions, and that the deep ocean in particular was a driving factor for taking up and storing significant amounts of carbon over a glacial cycle. Next, I discussed how the Southern Ocean is a region of net outgassing today because the biological pump essentially can't keep up with this oversupply of carbon and nutrients delivered by upwelling, and it has what we call a leaky or inefficient biological pump. But turning down that dial and reducing this huge supply of carbon and nutrients to the surface may have improved this and may have helped biology keep better pace with the supply and counteract some of that CO2 evasion. And finally, we indeed have proxy evidence that the carbon and nutrient content of Southern Ocean surface waters was reduced during glacial times, but it's still unclear how this was achieved. So changes in physical delivery alone, while helping, are unlikely to account for the full signal. And by contrast, a reduction in the carbon and nutrient content of the water itself is a largely under-considered possibility. All right. So moving into the second half of this talk, we're thinking about how to reduce the carbon and nutrient content of these waters upwelling in the Southern Ocean. And to start our discussion of this, let's consider where these waters get their carbon and nutrients from today. And thanks to some recent studies, including one by a SOFLUX committee member, so thank you for that, Channing, it's becoming increasingly clear that Southern Ocean outgassing is mainly fueled by carbon coming from the Indo and especially Pacific basins. So this is shown really nicely by this figure. And what's plotted here is capital P PCO2. So that's potential PCO2. So just like potential temperature, potential density, it shows the PCO2 value a water parcel would have if brought adiabatically up to the surface. So this just corrects for the compressive effects of depth on partial pressure. Now, the delta notation that it's expressed in here simply gives the PCO2 value in terms of the excess beyond a 400 ppm atmosphere. So it's effectively a measure of disequilibrium we're showing here, or rather, you can think of it as the potential for these different water masses to outgas should they reach the surface. So note that blue doesn't mean undersaturated or no outgassing potential. It just means very, very low carbon content, whereas waters in excess of 100 or 150 microatmospheres over the atmosphere, denoted in red and white, have lots of carbon and thus a high potential to outgas. So already we can see this clear distinction between the relatively carbon-poor Atlantic waters and the much higher outgassing potential of these Indo-Pacific waters coming in. And just to make this point a little bit further, I'll show some more figures. So be careful now, as red and blue indicate actual flux rates here. So outgassing is in red. And currently, the highest outgassing rates today occur in the Indian and Pacific sectors, which was also quantified very nicely in Channing's paper. Now, this is actually a result of deeper winter mix layers in the Indo-Pacific and greater entrainment of subsurface waters here compared to the Atlantic. But let's go back to thinking about the source of carbon fueling this outgassing and what's supplying these subsurface waters that the entrainment is tapping into. So this Chen study also identified this outgassing as clearly corresponding with this ring of high PCO2 water in the subsurface, which you can see plotted here at 800 meters depth. And furthermore, the core of this subsurface high PCO2 water coming up from depth very tightly follows and outcrops with this 27.8 isoneutral density surface, which characterizes the Indo-Pacific deep water mass. So this clear correspondence shows that the high PCO2 water fueling outgassing is coming from this water mass originating in the high North Pacific. But you could probably already tell that just from the figure on the left, where you see clearly this really high PCO2 water with delta PCO2 in excess of 150 microatmospheres just coming up to the surface. And by contrast, our Atlantic waters just don't hold so much carbon. Now, the reason for this difference in carbon content between the basins becomes clear if we think about the pathways and water masses at play. So the North Pacific has the world's highest PCO2 waters because these are the world's oldest waters. They're pretty well isolated from the surface, and they've been down at depth for a long time since they're mainly formed by slow interior processes and the slow diffusion of water up from depth. So this means they've had a much longer time to accumulate remineralized carbon before feeding up into the Southern Ocean. By contrast, we have a much more active and advective regime in the Atlantic. So we have active deep water formation in the north, which means this North Atlantic deep water has only recently come down from the surface and is relatively young. And furthermore, we have this overturning circulation that's constantly pumping these carbon poor surface waters down and throughout the basin. So again, this difference in carbon content comes from a difference in dynamics and specifically ventilation. The North Atlantic is very well ventilated and young, with little carbon having accumulated in it yet, whereas our North Pacific is very poorly ventilated and lacks that communication with the surface. So as a result, it's a very isolated reservoir and has had a long time to build up significant amounts of carbon. So keeping that present day dichotomy in mind, let's now look at, well, what did the North Pacific look like in the last glacial maximum? So again, this is peak glacial conditions when CO2 was at its lowest. This happened about 20,000 years ago. And in stark contrast to today, proxy data indicates that the high North Pacific was better ventilated in the LGM relative to modern. So this figure represents a compilation of 3 different proxies that are all indicators of ventilation strength given in the different shapes. And this figure also takes data from all available sediment core sites north of 20 degrees. So we've collapsed all the different latitudes onto this one plane here, and we're stretching across the basin from Asia and China on the left over across to the west coast of North America on the right. And what emerges is a clear signal of stronger ventilation at the last glacial maximum, pretty ubiquitously across the basin and also down to about 2,000 meters depth. Now, if you're wondering what drove this ventilation, what we have proxy evidence of is an increase in the surface water's salinity of the glacial North Pacific. So this would have contributed to the breakdown of the halocline we have there today and the onset of convection and ventilation. Now, as to why there were saltier surface waters in the North Pacific in the Ice Age, some of the proposed mechanisms include a weaker hydrological cycle under cold conditions, leading to less precipitation being brought up to the high latitudes. Also possible is more input of salty subtropical waters. So stronger westerly winds under a northern hemisphere ice sheet could have spun up the gyre and brought more of those subtropical salty waters north. And finally, greater sea ice formation and brine rejection could have induced very local but strong sites of convection, especially in marginal seas. So any and all of these could have contributed. The fact remains the North Pacific was better ventilated in the last ice age than it was today. So this begs the question, are we looking at, in the ice age, a more Atlantic-like regime with well-ventilated and carbon-poor waters now coming down and filling the basin? And furthermore, if this ventilation is reducing the carbon and nutrient content of this water, like it does in the modern Atlantic, what downstream impact could this have on Southern Ocean biogeochemistry? If these North Pacific waters were flushed of their carbon and nutrients, would that carbon and nutrient poor signal have reached the Southern Ocean as well? And actually, this connection between North Pacific and Southern Ocean biogeochemistry we have today is also seen in the proxy data. So if you remember this figure that we used to say that Southern Ocean carbon and nutrients were reduced, well, we see patterns very reminiscent of this in the North Pacific. Perhaps a bit more noisy, but we see a signal of the collapse of these purple lines in productivity alongside increasing nutrient utilization. And again, that very clear signal of more ventilation in the North Pacific as well. So this shared pattern just gives us more confidence that the biogeochemical makeup of these North Pacific waters is shared with the Southern Ocean and that these two regions are connected, even in the ice ages. All right, so this connection between the North Pacific and Southern Ocean biogeochemistry, even in the ice ages, prompted us to look at Earth system models with the ventilated North Pacific and see if this could explain the low carbon and nutrients in both regions. So I've compiled output from a few different models here, and the signal we get is that across a range of differing models and model setups, and even different ventilation strengths, if you simply compare two glacial-like simulations, either with or without North Pacific ventilation, you get this common signal of the ventilation reducing the carbon and nutrients of this North Pacific water. So we're looking at depth versus latitude here. So a transect straight up the middle of the Pacific Basin at 160 west. And each of these panels represents a different intermediate complexity Earth system model, which I've referenced the studies they come from here. Now, each of these studies induce ventilation in the same way. In all of them, there's a breakdown of the halocline and an associated onset of convection and overturning, which is illustrated here in the black lines for the ventilated UVIC simulation in a figure borrowed from that study. So to just easily compare these four different models, I've also indicated the intensity of ventilation in each one in terms of the strength of overturning that it induces in the North Pacific. So I'm happy to talk more details on these models later, but the main point here is that across different models, across different forcings, and even different ventilation strengths, if you break down that halocline and ventilate the North Pacific, it's a robust feature that it's going to reduce the carbon and nutrient content of these waters. Again, with that new overturning and ventilation now filling the basin with these relatively young and carbon poor surface waters rather than these mid depths being filled by the slow diffusion of old carbon rich water up from depth, as happens today. And excitingly, we also see these anomalies being translated up into the Southern Ocean surface with the outcropping of intermediate depth isopycnals, which is what these red and yellow lines are. And that's exciting because that's what we have the proxy evidence for, that reduced carbon and nutrient load. And that's what we need to alleviate biology from being totally overwhelmed by the carbon and nutrient supply and having a net outgassing. Now, to carry on in the talk, I'm going to move forward with just one of these models to avoid having 8 panels on every slide. And I'm going to carry on with the UVIC simulations from Minviel et al. 2014. And again, I'm happy to give more detail later, but the short of it is that these simulations were run in UVIC, which is an intermediate complexity Earth system model that uses MOM for its ocean. And I've put some other details on its configuration here. And I'm comparing the output of 2 simulations from this study, both run under glacial-like boundary conditions. One had freshwater forcing that broke down the halocline in the North Pacific, generating an overturning to the tune of about 12 spare-drips, which is shown here. And the control case lacked that forcing and so had no overturning and ventilation of the Pacific, but glacial-like in every other way. So we're just trying to isolate what is the specific effect of this ventilation. And I compared the output of these simulations after 1,000 years of runtime because that is how long they were run for. All right, so getting back into some more results. As we've already seen, yes, the effect of having a ventilated North Pacific versus not is to flush these mid-depth waters of their carbon. And this was just a figure I had to hand showing that anomaly growing over time and indeed originating in the North Pacific and making its way southward. Note also that this is showing DIC, but PCO2 and nutrient anomalies, phosphate anomalies also show the same evolution. Another crucial feature to note here is that we're not only delivering water of lesser carbon up to the surface, we're also seeing a signal of carbon accumulation in the depth, which is a key feature of the real glacial ocean. So as a result of ventilation, we're seeing a new partitioning and redistribution of carbon in the ocean out of these upper waters and preferentially more into this lower cell. and these deeper waters that have a much longer residence time and resurfacing time. So that's exciting. Going back to these ventilated mid-depth waters, these low carbon and nutrient waters are making their way south to the Southern Ocean, mainly diffusively along these isopycnals. And finally, they are upwelled into the Southern Ocean surface. So let's now look at some Southern Ocean plots. So yes, we do see this negative anomaly in both the nutrients and the PCO2 successfully translating up into surface waters. And these are just the same isopycnals that I showed before, plotted just to show them outcropping and corresponding with the anomaly delivered up from depth. So this is what we set out with our hypothesis. We've shown that a well-ventilated North Pacific can flush these waters, feeding the Southern Ocean of their carbon and nutrients. And again, this is something evidenced by proxy data. And as you'll remember, most explanations of this signal so far have relied exclusively on reducing the physical delivery of water from depth. And the exciting thing here is that we've been able to achieve this reduced carbon and nutrient load without the help of either of these things. So in our simulations, stratification and upwelling rates are virtually unchanged between our control and ventilated runs, meaning that hardly any of this signal is coming from a reduced delivery of water from depth. So without these two things acting, it just shows how powerful a leverage the compositional change of these supplying North Pacific waters, how much of an influence that can have on the Southern Ocean surface. So we're demonstrating that this alone can induce significant changes in the Southern Ocean by itself, to which the physical changes would have only added. Now, to wrap up the talk, the million-dollar question, does this reduced carbon and outgassing, carbon and nutrients in the surface actually result in reduced outgassing? And the answer is yes, it does. Oh, forgot some animations there. The answer is yes, it does. It does reduce outgassing. We have negative anomalies pervading wide regions of the Southern Ocean. And on the whole, taking the average south of 40 degrees south, we see outgassing is reduced by 0.18 moles per meter squared per year, which represents a 51% reduction relative to the control outgassing rates. And focusing on the Indo-Pacific sector, which shows the largest anomalies, we get an average reduction of 79% relative to the control. So yes, this study has demonstrated that ventilating the North Pacific on its own can have very substantial downstream effects on Southern Ocean biogeochemistry and outgassing. Now, it's a tantalizing result, and the logical question that follows is, does this in turn have an impact on atmospheric CO2, given that we were motivated by the question of the ice ages and stemming this leak as a way of keeping carbon preferentially in the ocean? Well, unfortunately, we can't get at this question as these simulations were only run for 1,000 years, and more time would be needed to draw down CO2 more. But I would say we do have things certainly going in the right direction. As I said before, we're already seeing that accumulation of carbon down at depth where we need it stored away from the atmosphere for long periods of time. While meanwhile, what we're actually feeding up to the atmosphere is much less carbon rich than before. So while there's more follow-up work to be done, what we have demonstrated as a first step is that North Pacific ventilation does reduce carbon and nutrient loads, evidenced by proxy data, and associated outgassing rates. And this is a novel result for being achieved without the help of any canonically invoked changes in upwelling and physical processes. So it serves as a proof of concept, demonstrating the potential importance of biogeochemical changes and deserves to be followed up, I hope, with a more dedicated set of simulations. So, to summarize everything, we have today talked about the ice ages and how the ocean is the main carbon reservoir that really helped to take up CO2 and drive us into the cold glacial conditions. And the Southern Ocean in particular is believed to be a key region for this, given its connection of the carbon-rich deeper waters and the surface. Currently, biological production is overwhelmed by an oversupply of carbon and nutrients from depth, which leads to this net outgassing. However, we have proxy evidence that these carbon and nutrient levels were reduced during glacial periods. So this likely would have contributed to stemming this leak, but the question is, how did we get this reduction? Well, most explanations so far have focused on reducing the physical delivery of water from depth, but here we considered whether the biogeochemistry of the water itself could have changed. So considering the dynamics of the modern ocean, where a well-ventilated Atlantic is relatively carbon poor compared to the poorly ventilated Pacific, we take this proxy observation that the glacial North Pacific was better ventilated in the past and ask whether this also could have flushed these waters of their carbon and nutrient content, like in the modern Atlantic, with downstream effects on the Southern Ocean. And finally, using Earth system model simulations, we compare a glacial-like ocean with Pacific ventilation to one without, and find that the effect of ventilating the North Pacific is indeed to reduce the carbon and nutrients of these mid-depth waters supplying the Southern Ocean, ultimately reducing the carbon and nutrient load as well as outgassing rates there. So again, this connection between the North Pacific and Southern Ocean biogeochemistry is a novel explanation not only of these proxy records, but of a mechanism that was likely important for glacial CO2 change. So I really do see this as an exciting avenue for future research, a new take on an old question, and I hope it will be tested further in the near future. So thanks very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thanks, Maddie. So yeah, we can open it up for any questions. Feel free to either just unmute yourself directly or you can raise your hand. Yeah, Mathilde.
Hi, thank you. This was a really fascinating and very clear talk. Um, I had a question about, so you mentioned at the beginning a couple of reasons why changes in ventilation in the Southern Ocean could not explain the changes that we see related to how like shifts in the wind could not explain it and things like that. So I was wondering if you had a sense of why that could work in the North Atlantic. You mentioned it could be related to higher salinity, reduced hydrological cycle, increased winds. So why would that be enough to drive these changes in the North Pacific if it was not in the Southern Ocean?
Right. If I've misunderstood your question, correct me, but there are totally different things going on in the glacial Southern Ocean and the glacial North Pacific. Um, and the canonical interpretation of those proxy records, let me go back to the proxy records that look exactly the same. Sorry, so far back. Okay. So you're asking about the different processes operating in the Southern Ocean versus the North Pacific and what could have ventilated them or not ventilated them and everything.
Yeah, it's just kind of surprising that it sounds like when you're starting to look at things, it's hard to find one process that would be enough to induce like such a big change. And then,
Yes.
but then you kind of see that there is something happening like that in the North Pacific. So I'm kind of wondering why, what that could be and why it could be so like finicky in the North Pacific.
Yes, I think you've touched on it exactly perfectly, that there can't be one process explaining all of this. First of all, the way that this is called the polar twins proxy records because they share these ups and downs and the indication of reduced nutrient supply. Historically, this has been explained by just the same process. Oh, maybe we had enhanced stratification blocking translation in the North Pacific and the Southern Ocean. Just by coincidence, they both happened to be having those processes happening at the same time. We are arguing, well, there's lots of evidence that it wasn't stratified, especially with that panel showing all the proxy data from 2,000 meters up. Also, this delta 13C proxy indicates it's not stratified. So then you could say, well, maybe upwelling was just reduced in both places. Well, it was, and it was in the Southern Ocean, not in the glacial North Pacific, and that's come out of more recent studies and everything. So again, that's a break in the chain of the same physical process operating in both locations. PMIP models show North Pacific winds enhancing, and so with more upwelling, that would have brought more nutrients up to the surface. So that doesn't explain it as well. We really need to be reducing the carbon and nutrient content of the waters that it's tapping into. I think I've gotten a bit rambly there, but if there was anything that was unclear that I didn't address your question with, I'm happy to ramble some more.
No, thanks. I mean, I think it's what you said. It's just a combination of things, and it happens to work in the Pacific. Yeah, thanks.
I certainly think both are happening at the same time, the physical processes I mentioned in the Southern Ocean, at least physical and biogeochemical. And that's how paleo things tend to go. It never is just one process operating. Even in the modern ocean, it's never just one process operating. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Okay, Kevin.
All right, thank you. Excellent talk. Very clear. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
On slide 10, can you go to slide 10, please?
Mhm. Yeah.
So what strikes me there is the red is rather shallow compared to the isopycnal that you need ventilated. I mean, that you need to have lower carbon on. Maybe that's just a question of where samples were possible. But that's something that I understand is difficult to carry across many of these models, which have all sorts of problems with their stratification, what isopycnals at what depth and so on. But do you have any insight to the apparent shallowness of the ventilation proxy compared to the depth that you actually need the water to be ventilated to?
Well, I suppose, are you asking about the isopycnal in the real ocean or the isopycnals in the models that I was showing?
Yeah, it's coming back to the real ocean. I mean, I think that as you pointed out, the physical processes in the North Pacific are dramatically different from Southern Ocean, and to get high salinities, it's very likely that brine formation, wind-driven brine formation, is going to have a major impact. And as you saw in those circulation schemes, the actual ventilation is confined to a tiny little latitudinal range in the very northern part of the North Pacific. But whatever that means in these models, it may not mean anything. But my point is simply that maybe I don't know the data very well myself, so I'm just wondering if those red spots, that look shallow, support lower carbon and lower nutrients at 3,000 meters as well.
Yeah, 3,000 meters, I would think, is quite deep, but the point you're making still holds. And my first response would be that it's a little bit of no one proxy or model picking up the full picture completely. Something that I haven't talked about in this talk is a sort of evolving paradigm of Pacific ventilation that there could have been more of a mid-depth shadow zone, more at like 2,000 to 3,000 meters, where carbon can accumulate, and then the actual communication does become a bit shallower. So whatever depth Indo-Pacific deep water that isopycnal is at now, I mean, this figure has it at 1,500 or 2,000 meters depth. What I'm trying to say is that there's some new studies coming out that indicates this a little bit more of a active bottom overturning and a little bit more active of an upper overturning, which is the ventilated stuff I was talking about in this talk. with a shadow zone in the Pacific developing where carbon accumulates. And most of this communication that happens at whatever depths these are today is moved a bit more shallow.
Those are good points. You expect that, right? You expect the nature of the deep circulation to change at about the sill depth of Drake Passage, 2,500 meters or so. And so these points that you're making, are things that are well understood in different contexts. And
In different
so
Yeah.
so that I think that all makes a lot of sense. The final thing I wanted to say is that to the extent that some of that increased ventilation is affecting the deep water in the Eastern Pacific, that's of interest too, because that seems to be where deep water exits the Pacific.
Mm.
And there's now evidence for eastern boundary currents that carry deep water out of the Pacific and inject it into the Southern Ocean. So I think that what you've said and the plots you show are all consistent with that.
Okay, good.
So
Thank
thanks.
you.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank you
very
very much.
interesting talk.
Great, thanks.
Okay, maybe Lionel.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Very nice talk, Maddie. I got the idea for carbon, but I'm not sure if this mechanism is supposed to also explain the increased nitrate utilization that you claim happens in the glacial periods. So does this also explain that, or is that something that is not explained by this mechanism?
Right, that's a very good question and a very tricky part of the talk to go through. You're asking, I'm saying that less nutrients are coming up into the surface, so how could we have more utilization with less nutrients coming up? Is that mostly correct? Right.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I guess I can see, I don't see having less nutrients a problem with higher utilization. That's not the issue that I see. I'm just not sure that I understand the connection between a higher nutrient utilization and the Northern Pacific being ventilated.
in the North Pacific specifically. I think the proxy records are just interpreted in the same way, in that because the productivity is being reduced alongside increasing utilization, those two observations together can only be reconciled with the overall supply becoming reduced. But perhaps what you're getting at is if we start ventilating the North Pacific and it has all of this subsurface carbon and nutrients remineralized, how could that lead to my interpretation of a reduced nutrient supply? Sorry, I think I'm muddling it a little bit. If you want to ask the question
So
one more time.
I'll tell you what I think is happening. For nitrate to be better utilized, you essentially will need to change the ratio of nitrogen and iron supply, because it seems to me that it's iron the one that is really preventing the full utilization. So
in the Southern Ocean, is it true in the North Pacific as well?
No, in the Southern Ocean. So
Okay.
my thinking is that by itself opening or ventilating the North Pacific is not going to change that ratio. But maybe by having less nitrogen relative to dust deposition, that would change or increase utilization. So you're bringing less nitrogen, and then you don't need so much. So that the balance between what comes from below and what comes from above, in terms of iron dust deposition, that balance kind of closes. So I don't know if this is the hypothesis that you had in mind, but this is the only way that I can kind of reconcile that part. Like I said, the carbon is clear to me, but the nitrogen utilization wasn't quite clear until,
Right. Okay, I'm following. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for going over it again. So you've talked about how you can alter the ratio of nitrate to iron to influence nitrate utilization, and that's what's happening in the Southern Ocean. So my interpretation of the North Pacific is that right now, convection and any kind of mixing taps into this really nutrient-rich water. But once this ventilation starts happening, the Pacific slowly evolves into a more Atlantic-like state. It's now filled with not remineralized nutrients, but nutrient-poor waters, both in the surface and the subsurface. There's proxy evidence from both levels. So you're altering that nitrate to iron ratio, not by changing your iron levels, but by now flushing this basin out of all of its nutrients. So that gross nutrient supply is going down and nitrate utilization goes up because it now is using up whatever is left, the small trace amounts left. Does that make sense?
It does, but I still think you need to have the dust deposition part into play
Yeah.
because you
Yeah.
need to change the ratio of dissolved iron to nitrogen. So I don't see if you bring less nitrogen, I don't see why you wouldn't bring less iron, and then the ratio itself is not changing, which is and
Mm,
it's the ratio of those two what is dictating the utilization. So what I'm
mm,
thinking is you're bringing less nitrogen that is more in accord where you're what is coming from above, and that balance is what is closing it up. But we can talk offline at some point. It was a
Yeah.
great talk,
Thank
though.
you.
Thank.
Thank you. And thank you for the question.
Yeah, thanks, Maddie. I think we're at the hour, so yeah, people can feel free to follow up with Maddie after. But yeah, thanks so much. It was a really nice talk, Maddie. I appreciate it. And
Thank
thanks
you.